As of the time of recording this, it is July 27th, 11:14 a.m., and if you're seeing this, welcome back. Imagine this. You're sitting at the park. It's a beautiful day. Clouds are in the sky. It's warm, but not humid. There's a bird circling hundreds of feet above you, just going around and around. From what you can tell, it's too high up to be hunting anything, but it just keeps flying around and around in circles. Eventually, it breaks off and flies off into the distance. Maybe you were right. Maybe that bird wasn't hunting anything, and it was just flying around in circles for the hell of it. This strikes you in a strange way. Suddenly, you have an idea. That bird was your muse, and you have to obey your urge to create. This is where I started. For this portrait, I wanted to lean into my creative process and explore how I interact with the world. The result itself isn't indicative of that on the surface, but it can be if you understand the context behind how I landed on my final product. I've always found it interesting the way that I approach synthesizing ideas. Seeing that bird at the park is a perfect example of that. Most of the time when an idea strikes me, it's a reaction more than anything. I start with the first thing that comes to mind and I build off of it until I'm satisfied with it. This reaction method is what pushes me through almost every piece of art I create, and this one is certainly no exception. To simplify the lengthy process that gets me to the end of a piece, I'm going to break it into 3 essential questions. Question 1, what do I pull inspiration from, and how do those things impact the way I synthesize an idea? Question 2, what does my actual process look like, and what steps do I take when creating something? And question 3, how does my reaction method affect my process and my product? These 3 questions are what can be used to understand exactly how I go from bird watching to creating the video you're seeing now. And we're going to start with my inspiration. Whether it be books, games, movies, or that one really specific social media post you saw 4 months ago that never really went away, inspiration can be found in pretty much anything. Near the end of June, Steam was running their summer sale. I was sitting there scrolling through all the deals and offers I had up, but nothing really caught my eye. That was until I stopped on Disco Elysium. I knew very little about the game, but I had wanted to play it for quite a while. Seeing it on a 90% discount was enough to convince me to buy it. When I first loaded in, the first thing that struck me was the visual style. It had this beautiful painted look that very particularly blended the brush strokes with the world. It was one of the most unique visual styles I had seen in the game, and the look alone was what kept me hooked. I played through the main story over the course of a week, and through all the content that I absorbed, the look and feel of the game is what stuck with me the most. This was the first step in gathering my inspiration. Because of Disco Elysium, I decided that I wanted to shoot for a textured, painted style with thick, obvious brush strokes. In my mind, the best way to do this was to use oil paint. With that idea in mind, I started sketching my thumbnails and figuring out the actual subject for the portrait. Remember that bird from earlier? When I say that that specific bird was my muse, I'm really not exaggerating. The first sketch I did was a depiction of myself as that bird, and that's what I built the rest of this project off of. After I drew that first thumbnail, I continued developing the idea, cropping the subject into just a bust and changing the head from a bird to a canine. And before anybody starts ripping into me, yes, that's a persona, and if you don't like it, you can stop him. Although the bird was what started this whole thing, it just didn't feel right, and in the end, changing it up was just another part of the process. Rest in peace, bird me. After I had the general composition felt out, and I added a bit of color in my sketches, I hit a minor roadblock. I needed to figure out what I was going to do with the background. After a day or 2 of brainstorming, I decided that I wanted to collage the background. I've worked with collage several times, and it is genuinely one of my favorite mediums to work in. I've always loved the feeling of tearing up other pieces of art and rearranging them into something new, and I had wanted to do another collage piece for a while, so this was perfect. With the collage idea figured out, it was time to actively gather inspiration. For this step, I went to Cosmos. If you're active on any social media platforms or engage with artists online, you may have heard Cosmos mentioned once or twice. The way I personally choose to describe it is Pinterest without the slop. Cosmos has one of the largest collections of art you've probably never seen, and it is one of the best places to find really specific inspiration. Some of my favorite images I collected were these bold, chaotic collage and mixed media pieces. These pieces gave off a messy but intentional look, and they were perfect for the vision that I had in mind. On the 7th of this month, I wrote this. I've been meaning to write anything about my ideas for this next portrait. Not sure exactly what to say. I've done a handful of sketches over the last week, and I'm pretty set on this idea. I am, in fact, so set on it, I've already bought my materials. I think I'm going to start for real tomorrow morning since I'm off work. Hopefully doing this will fill out my video more. I really want to make something a little longer this time. And on the morning of the 8th, I started working on my portrait. The first step to starting this portrait wasn't laying down my sketch, mixing my colors, or prepping my canvas, but rather bookmarking every single magazine I had bought to use as collage material for this project. I didn't have any specific thing I was looking for, and this forced me to really lean into the reaction method. In total, I went through 33 different magazines, but only ended up using material from about half of them. The majority of the magazines I bought came from these blind pack type things I bought from the half-price books in town. Each package had 5 magazines and only cost $1.50, so they were ideal for getting a large amount of material for super cheap. Opening each one almost felt like opening trading card packs, and I probably would have been just as excited about it if I wasn't planning on tearing most of them up. Anyways, between work, video games, and pure procrastination, I had bookmarked all of my magazines and was ready to start on the actual portrait itself by the 13th. The day that I started on the actual portrait, I was having trouble focusing. I couldn't bring myself to make the first mark, and I was just not in the mood to be drawing at the time. Instead of immediately drawing on the board, I decided that I wanted to go through all my old sketchbooks from high school and just kind of take a peek at everything. Weirdly enough, flipping through everything was kind of motivating, and it ended up being the push that I needed to start on the actual portrait. Just finished going through all of my sketchbooks from high school. Genuinely inspiring. Kind of weird how looking through all that made me want to work on my project. Gotta love it, I guess. I began with the sketch, laying down a light pencil drawing where I needed it. As you can see in the original framework, I was planning on adding the big yellow circle behind the head to add a sort of visual draw. When I stepped back and looked at it in full, I realized that the circle would take up much more of the board than I wanted it to. This presented my next problem. I needed to figure out how I wanted to fill the negative space behind the subject. Logically, I would just fill it with my collage elements and call it a day. But once I cut everything out, I was left with a disappointingly small pile of material. That was when I remembered the holy grail of material that I had simply forgotten about. Sitting on my shelf was an SVA application book. It was something I'd picked up in high school when I did my last big collage project. The book consists of information and art from students and staff alike, and it pretty much functions as a glorified advertisement for a prestigious art school in New York. The book is from the early 2000s and is an absolute treasure trove for interesting, unique, and downright weird art from hundreds of different minds. I'd gone through it before for collage material, and I knew that it would be the solution to my problem. The idea was to find several visually interesting pages, tear them out, and use them for my background. Between the SVA book and my plethora of magazines, I collected 10 pages to use for my background. In order to avoid burning myself out, I split this portrait into 2 parts, collage and painting. I started with the collage because I knew that as long as I lined my pieces up with the edges of my subject, I could always just paint over the parts that overlapped. This was definitely the way to go because although the overlap is a little obvious in some spots, if I had done it the other way around, I believe it would have turned out much worse. This time around, I actually recorded my process, which makes for a much clearer demonstration of my workflow. After I finished laying down the main portion of the background, I went over the edges of my subject with white acrylic to make sure that they were crisp. This really brought the outline back up to the surface, so I had something to go off of when I started painting. Then I glued down all the circles I had cut out. When I was flipping through my magazines, I noticed that I had bookmarked a strangely high number of circles, and I decided that I would cut them out and glue them down to my background to mirror the second color sketch I did and add a little visual variety. The entire background is just another example of me reacting to my materials and working within the restrictions, and I believe it really shows in the final product. After my background was finished, I gave it a day to dry, and I came back to lay my paint down on the 15th. When conceptualizing the idea for this portrait, there were a few things I forgot when it comes to oil paint. First off, that shit is so expensive. Oh my god, it was almost painful to see what it came up to for just 5 colors and some oil. Second off, I forgot just how long it takes for oil paint to actually dry. I've only worked with oil a handful of times, so my lack of experience, and admittedly lack of research, came back to bite me in the ass once I realized that my paint wouldn't even be close to dry by the end of July, let alone by the time I needed to start on my video. I let it sit for almost 4 days, coming in to check on it periodically, and even after that, it was still tacky at best. That's when I just decided to say, fuck it, we ball, and paint my outline in acrylic. Even before realizing that my paint would take a million years to dry, I wanted bold, almost cartoonish line work to my painting. This was meant to emulate the strokes of the pen in the original sketches, and I knew they wouldn't be perfect, but I wanted to almost lean into that, and in the end, I was satisfied with the final product. The very last step was to make a simple frame for it. I knew about halfway through creating the actual work itself that I wanted to somehow frame it. Initially, I wanted to go out and buy a frame that fit the dimensions, but sealing still wet oil paint behind glass or plastic just wasn't an option. The next best choice was to just create one myself. Ideally, I would have constructed a simple frame out of some scrap wood, but I just didn't have the time for that after I'd finished the painting. In the end, I resorted to a cardboard frame painted with black acrylic. Building the frame was easy enough, even if I did have to cut it down a few times to get it to fit. After it had time to dry, I hot glued it directly to my board. This is one of the only parts I'm not satisfied with. If I had the time to legitimately frame it, I would have, but I guess my urge to half-ass it outweighed my patience this time. If I were to say that this month's portrait taught me a lot, or that it was a great learning experience, I would definitely be exaggerating. The biggest thing I learned from making this portrait was that I definitely do have a method for approaching any given creative project. The main focus of this project was to explore that theme and present answers to my 3 big questions. The first question I asked was, what do I pull inspiration from, and how do those things affect how I approach synthesizing an idea? The answer to this one will always be different based on what I'm working on. For this specific project, it was previous works of mine, a video game I played recently, and a random bird of the park. To put it simply, inspiration can come from anything. No matter how small or stupid you think the idea is, if something sparked it, maybe it's worth it to just lean into it. For me, most of the time, the forming of an idea comes naturally. As much as I would love to, I just can't force it. Question number 2 was, what does my actual process look like, and what steps do I take when creating something? My personal process is messy and, for a lack of better terms, unrefined. Despite that, I find that I almost never change how I approach creating my works. Some people may disagree, but I love creating off of impulse. I can pretty confidently say that I thrive under pressure, and some of my best pieces come from reacting in the moment. That being said, I do still try to follow a loose structure when I begin working on my next piece. The first step for me is always brainstorming. Think of what inspires you. Write every little thing down. Become a daydreamer. Then I'll mix inspiration gathering and drawing my thumbnails. I cannot stress enough how important thumbnails are to landing on an idea. A thumbnail is a quick, easy way of putting your idea on paper. It's that idea of just make it exist first, you can make it good later. Last is finally moving on to the creation of the work itself. And that leads me to my last question. How does my reaction method affect my process and my product? The reaction method is the most constant variable for me when I work, and because of it, I almost always end up satisfied with what I've created. I'm a firm believer of creative expression and freedom, and part of that belief is not limiting yourself. Don't get me wrong, working within certain parameters is a great way to limit yourself creatively. What I'm saying is that you can't get so stuck on a certain idea that you never think to step outside of it or alter it in any way. Change is the only constant, and if you can accept that in respect to your creative works, you may just end up creating something that you love. Keeping those things in mind is what helps me work through a project the way that I do, and maybe it'll help you too. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Although it was pretty standard for me, this portrait was still very fun to make. In the end, I believe I did a pretty thorough job of exploring the questions that I presented to myself, and I'm happy with the product being this video and the piece of art itself. If you enjoyed this and you would like to see more, supporting me on my platforms is the best thing you can do. Until next time, keep loving art, fuck AI, and create beautiful shit.